Welcome, everybody. Hope you had a great reInvent so far. Very excited to have the opportunity to speak with you all. My name is Paras Bua. I've been with Amazon for a little over 7 years, and I currently work as the tech lead for migration specialist. In my role, I work with enterprises such as United Health Group, Anthem, Humana, and other customers to help them migrate to AWS, right? And on the personal side, I'm married to my high school sweetheart for about 15 years Monday, so I better remember that date so I don't get in trouble. And I have two beautiful children. Daughter is 12, son is 2. And initially when I started working at Amazon about 7 years ago, after the first week, my daughter would ask me, "Daddy, how many boxes did you pack?" I'm like, 0. And then a couple of weeks later, she's like, "Daddy, did you pack any boxes finally? Did you get a job?" Like, I have a job, but I did not pack any boxes today. And then she goes, "How come you get $100 a month for not packing any boxes, and I get 25 cents for cleaning my room?" So that's an interesting thing that happened for me personally. And it's been an evolution. Now they love the Kindles, the Alexa, they love Amazon Prime, they love Amazon Music. So they're all getting very immersed into the ecosystem, right? And they're still trying to, my daughter sort of now understands what I do at AWS and what the cloud is, what cloud computing is, right? So today we're here to talk about migrations to AWS. How do you set up the right foundation for enterprise transformation, right? So what can you expect from this session, right? Let's understand why migrations are foundational for enterprise transformation, right? We need to understand the why, right? And I'm not going to spend too much time on that slide, especially because this is a 300-level session, so we got to get a little technical, pretty deep into technology. Then let's talk about the migration methodology, right? For those of you that might not be familiar, let's go through that quickly. After that, we'll talk about the landing zone, right? And if you don't know what landing zone means, that's okay. We'll cover it, right? And then we'll talk about the migration factory, which is important so you can accelerate the pace of your migration to AWS. And then we'll have Rajiv come up here from United Health Group. Very excited that he's here from UHG talking about their journey and their challenges and how they came about solving some of those challenges to succeed on AWS, right? And then finally, I'll leave you with some ideas on what you can do as soon as you get back. So let's answer this question, right? So I'm going to have you consider a few statistics, right? Think about this. The average life of an S&P company has gone down to only 15 years, right? 2/3 of money, budget, goes towards KTLO, keeping the lights on. And 66% of CXOs still believe there's a security risk, right? What does this tell you? It basically tells you that you have to innovate. You have to move fast. You have to keep up with all the new startups that are coming in. And same thing for startups, right? They've got to be able to compete. Now, if you look at the technology landscape, it's gotten to the point where the playing field is equal for everybody, right? Startups have the same access to the infrastructure that all of us have, right? Enterprises have the same. Earlier, it used to be the cash-rich companies, right? The enterprises only were the ones that had money to go procure expensive software and build all these big teams. But with the cloud, all that has fundamentally changed, right? So if you look at some of the proven business values, these are public statistics available on our site as well. So look at all these savings, right? And the one point specifically I'd like to call out is downtime, right? In the earlier days, we always used to have this problem where if you had a downtime, it took a long time and it took a lot of resources to come up. That has gone down 94% because of the way now you can now architect on AWS, right? The multi-AZ architectures, the multi-region architectures, all the fault tolerance that is built in with these architectures, right? And even if you look at serverless, it becomes even more easier because now you're taking away that undifferentiated heavy lifting of even managing EC2 instances, for example. And in my career, and I'm sure you guys will agree with this, no company has ever been very successful based on how well they manage their infrastructure. It doesn't happen. Companies are making progress and leading the way based on the features and services they provide to their customers. So if you look at the development velocity that AWS provides, we've seen a typical 3x more features, which means that you can now have teams experiment a lot more than you could have in the past, right? So with that, let's look at some of the elements, right, of a successful journey. What does it look like? The number one thing, the absolute critical thing, is having executive sponsorship, right? You'll have small projects kick off, come on, come off every now and then, right? They'll succeed. But if you are talking about a large migration, if you are talking about a company-wide transformation, it will not happen till the time you have support from the top, right? It just doesn't happen. So we've seen this over and over, thousands of migrations across customers. And the pattern is, if you have really good support from the top, you will have a very likely higher chance of succeeding in your effort, right? So the rest, I'm not going to read through all this, but org change, you've got to define that well. You've got to have a good adoption roadmap. You've got, look at establishing a cloud center of excellence, and these are the folks that build all these core services that the rest of the organization can use, right? So if you look at the migration, now let's talk about the migration journey, right? What does the process look like? First one is what we call, the business case, right? You've got to understand how much am I going to pay once I'm there? What are my savings? What do I have? And how do I move it, right? So you've got to prepare first for the migration, right? You've got to build that business case. You've got to make sure that the numbers align, right? And if you look at the savings, it's very obvious, right? If you, base your TCO on a utilization rather than a allocation percentage, you will save a lot of money right there, right? And then there are all these other factors that you can use, like optimizing costs using serverless, going from a monolith to a microservice model, going from an Oracle to Aurora, going from a commercial platform, data warehouse platform to Redshift. These are all ways that you can save a lot of money, right? The next one is what we see, is portfolio discovery. Now, I'm yet to come across a company that has an up-to-date CMDB. Just doesn't happen, right? Over time, people come, people go, changes get in. Somebody's running a small rack in their office, right? Okay, and those things usually pile up to the point where you don't have enough information, you don't have complete information, which is why you need to do a portfolio discovery and analysis, right? So we'll talk about some of the tools that you can use to do exactly that. The third one is the actual migrations, right? This is where you're looking at setting up this factory approach, and we'll talk a lot about how do you set up this factory for migrations, right? And then finally, it's about operating and optimizing, right? I look at it and I say, look, it's not just about operating in the cloud, but it's making sure that you are continuously optimizing for every aspect of your cloud usage, right? Of your IT infrastructure, of your business. It's about making sure you optimize for cost, making sure you optimize for security, making sure you optimize for compliance, and all the other hosts of reasons that you would optimize for, right? With that, let's talk about the landing zone, right? So for a moment, imagine that you are responsible for running an airport in a thriving metropolis, something like this, right? You are responsible for running this, right? You are the architect that is running this currently, right? It's, for those of you that don't know, this is Canberra Airport. My friend John lives in Canberra, so he gave me this image. So thanks, John. And now, as an architect, you have to go from here to here. You have to build a big airport, right? Massive airport that supports international flights, supports hundreds of domestic flights every day, right? So what are the things you have to think about, right? You have to think about how does traffic move, right? For the planes, the vehicles supporting the planes. You got to think about how do people move? How does staff move, right? Who has access to what pieces? So where are passengers allowed to go? Where are they not allowed to go? How does staff get into the airport terminals? How do you make sure that you're handling baggage in the right way? And you've got to have other things, because this is such a large airport, you've got to think about things like quarantine, right? For things that are not allowed in the country. You've got to think about customs. You've got to think about immigration, right? There's so many things that you've got to think about, because this is such an expensive piece of infrastructure. You've got to make sure that this is running at peak capacity, right? Now, you might be thinking, Paras, this is great, How does this align to what I'm going to do at AWS? Well, the same concepts apply. When you're on AWS, you've got to think about who has access to what. How does traffic flow within your VPCs? How does traffic flow from your on-prem data center to AWS? What calls are you going to be making? Who has access to what, right? You've got to figure out all these things before you start building that airport, right, or that big model that you're going to use. Now, a lot of customers will start with one account, right? Maybe you're a single guy, right? You're a single person. You're a person that has multiple projects, maybe, right? So you start off on your journey, and you say, OK, one VPC, I'm going to start with a /16 big starter block. I'm going to deploy everything in there. But before you know it, other people are saying, well, can I host my application in your account? You'll be like, sure. What happens if 50 people come and do the same thing, right? Now you are running into a challenge where you're potentially stepping over each other and accidentally deleting somebody's resources, or you're accidentally making mistakes, right? I've seen customers with thousands of accounts, right? Everybody gets an account, right? Every division has an account. But for the most part, we see organizations somewhere in the middle, right? So why is one account not enough, right? First thing, you've got many teams, right? A lot of teams within your organization, they have their own processes, which means you don't get the level of isolation that is required. Now, the way we look at it, right, is the best isolation that you can have is an account, right? The separation is at an account level, right? It's no different if you spin up an account or if I spin up an account. The level of separation is the same, right? It's completely separate. It's distinct. You've got a lot of different teams have different security reasons, right? They have different compliance controls. How do you manage that? Different teams have different business processes, right? Maybe you're a big retail company. There's a B2B retail side. There's a B2C retail side. You might both have different processes that you need to adhere to. And finally, it's billing, right? How do I get the true separation from a billing perspective until I have a different account, a separate account, right? Now, you might be thinking, of course, you're going to tell me, go have multiple accounts, hundreds of accounts, because it means we're going to pay you more money, right? Guess what? Accounts are free, correct? IAM users and roles are free. There's no charge. There's no cost to creating more accounts unless you start instantiating resources and starting up resources in that account, right? So the only reason we are asking you guys to think about this, asking enterprises to think about this, is to truly get that level of separation, limiting the blast radius, right? If a bad actor gets into one account, that's fine, right? You just shut that account, right? But if a bad actor gets into your main account, if you only had one, we're in trouble, right? We have a lot of problem, right? Now, because one part of the business is impacted, which starts to spread across others, but if only one account is impacted, you're limiting that blast radius, right? So what are some of the goals, right? As you start to think about these things, right? Now, you're an architect that's building this massive piece of infrastructure. Some goals you've got to keep in mind, right? The first thing, you've got to keep it automated, right? You've got to make sure it scales. It scales up and down based on resources. You've got to make it self-service. So can I give you a service catalog, right, of approved services and products that you can use for development? Can you make it easier? Can I have guardrails and not blockers? By this, I mean, so there are two types of controls, right? There's a preventive controls, preventive guardrails, and detective guardrails. Preventive guardrails are things that I absolutely don't want anybody to do, right? For example, I don't want anyone to turn off CloudTrail in their accounts. And why is that? The reason is, you want to know every action that is being taken on every account. You've got a centralized logging account where all these CloudTrail logs go. So that way, you know everything that's going on. So you might not want to have anyone have the ability to turn off CloudTrail logs, right? In that case, you can use a preventive guardrail. A detective guardrail on the other side, and I can maybe use a real story. When I started at AWS and Redshift for launch, I was super excited, right? So I went in, spun up a Redshift cluster, And like it's all easy for software developers, open it up to the entire world, right? So I opened it up /0. 2 hours later, I get an email with a ticket assigned to me saying I violated company policy. You are not supposed to have anything open in the public. Go fix it. I was scared. I was like, oh my God, what happened? This is my first week, right? This is my first month trying a new service. But then, I had a public data set that didn't have any confidential information. I was able to go shut it down in the next 5 minutes, and we were able to resolve the ticket, right? But if you think about what it did to me, it started getting me to think. The next time I got to be more careful, right? So the company allowed me to take a risk, but at the same time corrected my behavior so I could be part of the solution. I felt like I was part of the security solution to make sure that this Redshift cluster and other clusters that might be open is secure, right? So how can we move towards that model where we are incentivizing our builders to go build new stuff and taking risks while having these detective guardrails to correct them if something is not right, right? Trust but verify, right? It's important. So if I can achieve 5 of these, I'm automatically able to achieve flexibility, right? So how do I go about building a landing zone? Now you must be thinking, okay, I understand the problem. I understand what my goals are. How do I build? Now you got to start with the business needs, right? And this doesn't mean stop everything, panic, go write a bunch of business documents. No, but you've got to have some level of business requirements that you start with, right? So we already talked about accounts. So I'm not going to get into it again, but maybe this is the first thing you do, right? You figure out your account structure. You got to think about network, right? Where am I going to route my domains? Where am I going to host my domains? How does my on-prem data center communicate with AWS, right? You got to think about that. You got to think about where am I going to host my direct connect? How are these teams that are going to start building use that direct connect facility that I'm providing? You got to think about security, right? Where do my logs go? How do I make sure my configuration changes are up to date? How do I make sure that I have OS images that are updated with the latest security software patches, right? To make sure that everybody is using the same image. And then you got to think about IAM, right? This is concepts that are familiar to most of you. You got to think about access. You might have invested in some identity solution. Can we use that to federate, right? You got to think about that. And once you've built that, you got to give it in the hands of users. Now, these users are app teams that are going to go build and deploy their applications on AWS, right? You got to think about what kind of service catalog can I give them, right? Can I already have a list of approved software that they can just use? So that way they don't have to go to security each and every time. Of course, it needs automation, right? And then you got to think about how are they going to deploy this, right? What are the pipelines they're going to use to deploy this to the cloud? And then what's next, right? So you've built this infrastructure, you got to think about what's next. So I think about it in 3 ways, right? This is your airport infrastructure that you've built out, right? Expensive piece of infrastructure. You put in a lot of effort and thought into this. The 3 things that I think about is first, help customers migrate. So these are your internal teams that are migrating. You got to iterate. Of course, you're going to learn. You're not going to get it perfect on day 1. You're going to learn. You're going to iterate. You're going to make it better. And the same thing, right? You're going to operate and you're going to optimize it, right? So optimizing your landing zone is critical so that your teams can now start to innovate on the cloud, right? So I'm going to go directly into this recommended landing zone slide. Now, don't panic. There's lots of stuff over here. Let's break it down, right? The first thing, you start with the organization's master, right? This is your master account that very select few people have access to. And at this layer, you can start to have service control policies like the one we talked about, right? Don't have the ability to turn off guardrails. For example, you can't turn off CloudTrail accounts. So even if you gave an account to someone in your company, they will not be allowed to turn off CloudTrail, right? And things like that, right? So maybe you have a highly, it's purely internal. You don't want anyone to have access to the internet via the IGW. You can put that as a service control policy right there, right? Now, the next level, right, is where you start talking about foundational OUs, right? These are foundational OUs that are core and managed by 2 teams, right? Security team and your infrastructure team. And if you look at the security teams, the boxes in blue are OUs, the triangles are accounts, right? So you've got your security account, right? Your security OU, and within that you've got two OUs. Now, just like how we all develop applications, the security folks are also developing security tooling, right? Service control policies that they'll apply across. They're working at building tooling that is required for all sorts of security things, right? So that's why you have an SDLC and a production account, OU. And then you got the same structure on the infrastructure side. Now on the security side, you've got to think about log archives, right? Where do my logs go? You got to have a security read-only account. You got to have a break glass account, which is never used until the time a security account is compromised, right? You never end up using that. Now, if you think about the security tooling, we talked about it, right? Where you have these teams are building security tooling, and they're thinking about how do I build the right tools so I can manage my infrastructure more securely, right? On the infrastructure side, you got to think about shared services, right? You got to think about network, direct connect. How are my customers going to use it, right? Now coming to the right, so those are your foundational OUs, right? You're figuring out all the core services that are required for all the teams to be able to consume, right? Now, if you look at additional OUs, the first thing is sandbox, right? Now, a company that, if you heard Jeff Bezos talk, he talks about innovation, right? He talks about why we need experimentation. Some experiments will not work. Most experiments will not work, right? But some will. But the ones that will work, that do end up working, will pay for everything else. So think about Kindle. It was an experiment. Think about AWS. It was an experiment. Think about Alexa. It was an experiment, right? So what if we give every new person that comes into a company an AWS account, saying go play with it, right? Go learn, go innovate, go experiment, do whatever you want to do, right? Maybe host your personal blog. It's fine. Has a fixed spending limit, right? Maybe it's $50 or $100, right? Every month, this is all you get. So you're incentivizing. This becomes a perk for your employees, right? For new employees, this literally becomes another benefit that they get, right? Here they're going and learning all the new services. They're trying something new. Maybe it works, and then you can push it to a POC account, right? So this, of course, is completely disconnected from the network. So anything that they do is isolated, right? It's within that one account. Cannot talk to anything else. Can't do anything else. The next one is where you're hosting your workloads. So same structure. You got your SDLC OU. You've got your production OU, and this is where the deployment happens, right? The logs from the SDLC go into the security SDLC OU. From production, it goes into production. Same for infrastructure as well, right? So it's all, clear swim lanes for each of these OUs. The next one is policy staging, right? You've got your service control policies that you're rolling out. You're using for that. Next one is suspended accounts. These are accounts where an employee left. You're tagging it. You're putting it in this OU. It stays there to a certain amount of time till you decide to tear it down, right? Then you have individual business users that might have unique use cases, right? So you have an OU for that. You've got exceptions. Of course, you'll have exceptions, right? Some, let's say you're a large healthcare company, right? And you need to share some policy documents with external vendors for whatever reason. You can, highly regulate it. You got to be very careful. It needs an exception from security. You put it in that OU, right? And then you've got your final deployments OU where you're basically doing all your deployments. So if you think about this structure, right? Now, of course, your structure might be, you can use this using Control Tower, but you've got to think about all these different aspects as you start to build your landing zone. Where are you going to land your workloads? And how are you making sure that your teams are innovating at the pace that they should be innovating, right? Experiment. Give them access. Use detective guardrails, right? So with that, let's now pivot into, well, all this is great. I built my framework. I've got this ready. How do I now start to migrate using a factory approach? So if you look at our approach, right, very high level, 30,000 feet, you got your portfolio assessment, you've got your migration phase, then you've got your operations phase. The first one is where you're really planning, right? You're really figuring out what are those assets, what are those applications that I'm going to first discover, right? What do I want to do first, right? I want to make sure that I have, selected applications that are, maybe easy to move or maybe have a business need, right? So you're having a backlog of applications that are ready to, go into the assessment phase. The next one, you're getting into the migration phase, right? This is where you're starting to use those repeatable assets, like tooling, things like that, to get into the migration phase. And then you're doing cutover, operating, and optimizing. So if you think about the key roles of a migration factory, on the left, you've got the business office. These are the finance folks, the business leaders that make decisions on how they want to see their apps moving. Of course, it's somewhere, if you're a retail company and if it's somewhere closer to Thanksgiving, you don't want to touch your retail website, right? So these guys will have, these folks will have input into how you design your migration plan. You got a migration program manager as well, who's doing all the tracking and helping you manage the program at scale. And then at the bottom, you've got the foundational layer, and these are the cloud platform teams. These are the teams that are building that foundation layer, like the landing zone that we talked about, right? So these are the teams that are doing that, right? Then you've got your app owners and support teams. These are the folks that actually own their applications and also support them, right? And these are the folks that will actually end up migrating as well, because they know where they're going and how they want to migrate, right? On the migration factory side, you've got portfolio leads and multiple migration leads that are primarily looking at repeatable patterns and what can be put in from an automation perspective to continue to increase the velocity of the migration, right? So with that, let's talk about the 7 R's of migration, right? Now, every application in your portfolio will have one of these 7 R's. The most common that you see is rehost, right? I've got a bunch of x86 compatible hardware here, Linux, Windows, whatever. I'm just going to pick them up, use some tools, move them to AWS. It's the first thing, right? The next one, you might say, well, can I move my HR system to Workday or my sales application to Salesforce, right? That's where you talk about repurchasing, right? Buying a carts, commercial off the shelf or software as a service, right? Maybe you move towards that. Replatform is what I like to call lift, tinker, and shift. Lift and shift with minor refactor. So think about things like moving from an F5 load balancer to an elastic load balancer, right? Simple, easy to do. Think about moving from an Akamai maybe to a CloudFront. Again, that's value proposition from a cost perspective and from a scale perspective. And it's fairly, it's easier to do that, right? Compared to rewriting the whole thing. The next one is refactor. This is where we start to think about, for example, you have a large monolith and you need to break it down into a microservice model. How do I do that? So I'm going to tear it apart. I'm going to re-architect it. I have teams going and building software, building those in smaller ways. Maybe use a strangler pattern, right? You start to slowly strangle pieces of the application before you completely cut over and migrate out of that, right? And then you've got the relocate, which is for VMware on AWS. This is a pattern. And the last two ones are things that you decide to either retain because it's not very critical, or you decide to just retire, right? So this is important context for you to have before we get into the subsequent slides, right? So tooling, the next one we'll talk about is tooling. Very important that you have tooling as part of your migration factory, right? So if you look at the tooling portfolio, AWS provides a large portfolio of tools that you can use in every phase of your project, right? So for example, if you had to do a TCO analysis, right, a detailed business case, TSO Logic, which is a company we acquired back in 2018, December 2018, you could use that. You could use Migration Hub, which is basically the one-stop shop for you to be able to manage and track your migrations, right? If you look at the second phase, which is the readiness and planning, you can use your application discovery service, right? This is an agent-based solution that you can deploy to your hosts and get detailed information about what's running in what servers, what are the processes, what are the threads. So you can really get a detailed view so you can make informed decisions on which move first and which move next. And how do you actually provision, right? You might have, and it'll capture things like utilization data. So you might have applications that are provisioned at 100%, but only utilizing 50%, right? So you can downsize those instances when you get into AWS. If you look at the execution phase, of course, I'm not going to touch on all these given we don't have enough time. But two services that I like to call out. One is Cloud Indoor, which will help you migrate at a block level block level replication tool, right? So it'll help you migrate your VMs from on-prem to AWS. This is another company that we acquired last year or early this year, right? And then database migration service, where you can have homogeneous and heterogeneous migrations. So homogeneous migrations are where you're moving from one engine to the same engine. So maybe you have a Microsoft SQL Server and you're moving to a Microsoft SQL Server, right? Which is a pattern that we see for customers when they want to just get off their data centers due to whatever reasons they have. Maybe it's a data center exit strategy. Maybe it's a modernization strategy. So they move out from maybe SQL Server to SQL Server to start with. Heterogeneous migrations on the other side, and you heard Andy talk about migrations, and you heard him talk about database migrations at his keynote, right? We see a lot of customers moving to Amazon Aurora, right? So if you have an Oracle, for example, which you want to get out of, right? You can move to Amazon Aurora Postgres, right? So we recently at Amazon completed our entire Oracle migration. And you might have seen some, press release or videos on Twitter, right, where the teams went and shut things down the last instance. So we moved our entire data warehousing platform to Amazon Redshift, right? So think about tools that you can utilize as you go through building your migration factory, and so that you can accelerate the migrations, right? So how do I set up a migration factory? I create a Tiger team first, right? I have a team of experts in every area that can go in and build those foundational standards. I see the migration backlog, right? I have these apps that I've already assessed. Now I can start to move them, right? I define the migration methodology, right? This is the 7 R's that we talked about a couple minutes ago. Pick which strategy you're going to go for every application. Then I run it in an agile manner. I actually get into the factory model, saying, guys, we've picked out which strategy we're going to use. Maybe it's a rehost or replatform. If it's a rehost, it's straightforward, right? You move them into the migration phase. If it's a refactor, you give them specifications on what are the things that need to be refactored, right? And then you see continuous improvement, right? And in the middle of all this, right, you have these modernization opportunities, right? Moving from a monolith to a microservice model, moving from a old guard technology vendor to a modern database like Amazon Aurora, right? So I also have a passion for serverless. How any of you have passions for API Gateway, Lambda, Dynamo? Great. Okay, a few people, right? So last year I had the opportunity to speak with Fender Guitars, those amazing guitar company, and they moved a monolith from Oracle to DynamoDB, right? It's complete. So from a schema-based monolith to a NoSQL database using a microservices approach. And if you look at some of the results, the whole talk is available on YouTube, so feel free to take a look. This is where customer and me, we get into a lot of detail around microservices, API gateway. There's even a demo in there if you're interested to go take a look, right? So amazing results, right, that they achieved. 41 I don't know how to go back, but how they eliminated their hardware purchasing. So 41 currencies, big landscape, right? They eliminated hardware purchasing and licensing. At least a 50% page load improvement. And this is a big app, right? This is the dealer portal that's used by thousands of dealers across the world. Their license maintenance costs went down 100%. Customer satisfaction went up significantly. Orders went up, again, significantly. And this is the favorite part. They are paying 51 cents for 10 Lambda functions in production, right? So think about that scale. It's really cost effective, really well architected. So here's their architecture, right, that they built out. Now, obviously, I'm not going to get into every piece of the architecture, but you can see that they're using Node.js. They've got a bunch of Lambda functions. They're using SES, Elasticache, API Gateway, DynamoDB, CloudFront, Direct Connect. So truly modern architecture, right? Another example is this one, right, where you have a web application that can scale across millions of concurrent users for very, very large audience, right? So let's say you're running a poll across 1 billion people, and you had to build this application that is going to run that poll, this is how you could do it in a truly serverless way, right? So if you look at this architecture, none of this architecture has any component that requires you to manage infrastructure, right? No EC2, no EBS, nothing, right? It's all serverless, scales dynamically, up and down based on the need, right? And then I'm using techniques such as aggregations using DynamoDB streams so that I'm not overburdening one DynamoDB table and running into things like a hotkey issue, right? Which happens if there is, from an indexing perspective, it happens when there is extreme load on one side of the partition, right? So some really interesting architectures there I thought I could share with you. And with that, I'd like to welcome Rajiv Cyrus from United Health Group to walk us through their journey.
Hey folks, hear me okay? Excellent. So that's me, Rajiv Cyrus. I work for UHG, United Health Group. Here to talk to you about some of the challenges that we faced as a large enterprise with adopting public clouds and Amazon here, AWS. United Health Group's a pretty big company. It's made up of United Healthcare and Optum, particularly. I work at Optum. My badge is orange. My paycheck is blue, as I like to say, right? So, but of the numbers, there's about 300,000 employees between UHC and Optum, but 181,000 of them are in Optum themselves. And roughly, 40,000 are software engineers. We have a large number of applications and lines of businesses, many, many thousands. So when I was asked to do this talk, I kind of thought about what would be interesting to talk about for enterprise migrations. We could talk about how applications can be modernized, moved over, lifted and shifted, or I thought it might be more interesting from your seats here to think about the challenges or learn about the challenges a company like mine has when we do this, right? So it's not just a scale, it's a big company, we have big data stuff, but really it's the scope is the problem that we face. Optum, again, it's just part of the company. When I talk about the things we do here, at Optum, we develop the frameworks that we have for this, but it works across the entire enterprise. But this is just Optum here. 4 to 5 health plans are touched by our products. 9 out of 10 providers, hospitals and so on, are using our products. 121 million consumers, that's just 121 million individual users. It's 121 times all of these things. All 50 states, federal agencies, you name it. We have quite a bit of data, every classification, PHI, personal health information, PII, PCI, you name it. We have to meet any number of compliance regulations, HIPAA, FISMA, RZ, all the stuff, right? So the scope is very large. Many thousands of applications of all across the globe, made by any number of those groups of engineers and with different technologies. So this talk is kind of broken into 2 parts. The first part is this, right? This kind of touches on what Praz had mentioned earlier about the enterprise journey. So it's interesting when him and I were speaking about putting this deck together, we already did this organically, right? We weren't engaged with the partner service at that point. This is several years ago. We came up with this, right? But the essentials, these 4 things kind of touch on that big enterprise journey landscape thing he had shown earlier. Leadership support, vision, stakeholders, and plans. Kind of collapses all down together. So the first one, leadership support. Praz mentioned earlier too, this one's critical, right? More often than not, and this happened at UHG, Optum, folks will just get a cloud account. They'll put it on their corporate card, their purchasing card, whatever. They'll start doing something. Who knows if they're compliant, what kind of data they're putting up there. As soon as that's found out, it's pretty much just shut down. It's not going to be successful. What you have to have is your executive leadership understanding what we're trying to do with cloud so we can get on board. But when you do that, you just can't say, go to cloud, Mr. CEO or whoever, right? We have to find the parameters and what the expectations are for the company. So at Optum, our parameters were pretty easy to start with, right? Our data centers are fine. We're not evacuating data centers. We want to use public cloud capabilities. We're not an infrastructure company. We don't have a lot of the really cool features AWS has. We want to use some, or all of them. But we have huge data gravity. We have compliance needs, contract needs. Our data centers are going to stay around. So the parameter is, when we migrate applications, can we take the opportunity to also modernize at the same time? So the expectations are, if you're a first wave application team that wants to migrate to a public cloud or AWS, you're going to have to help us build our framework, right? I'll further slides down, I'll talk about what that is and kind of what I mean by help us build the framework. So we set the cloud bar higher, right? So we had the 7 R's. We really focus on the first two, refactor, replatform. Lift and shift is not part of our landscape today. It will be in the future as we evolve this framework. So that framework evolution, so on, that's kind of a vision, right? So we have, keep your North Star, because as you start to break down these 4 steps or these 4 categories, there's a lot of noise that kind of creeps in, a lot of different directions you get pulled into, a lot of things you have to solve. But if you have that vision set, put it in a frame, put it way up high, whatever, put a bunch of lights on it, always keep that in mind. So at Optum, our main vision is we want to be cloud native. Whenever we put workloads into AWS or other public clouds, we have to be cloud native as much as possible, using Lambdas, RDS, EMR, whatever, right? Because that's the whole point. We're pushing all that work down that we don't want to do to Amazon. That's why we have the agreements, right? So our frameworks have to be flexible and, of course, modern. So when we modernize, use the modern frameworks. Everything is code and community involvement. Now, we'll touch on those 2 things in a bit here, but I think those 2 are more important ones. Well, stakeholders. Stakeholders are your key groups, right? That's just not your customers. Inside of Optum, our customers are ourselves and commercial customers that we sell products to. But that also means like your IAM team, your enterprise security, network security, procurement, legal, right? If you don't include your stakeholders early on or as you iterate through this, you're going to find yourself in a spot where, what about me, right? You didn't talk to me about this. You've already done a lot of work, but you have to undo it now because I have needs you have to cover. So like for a couple examples here at Optum, our enterprise security standards were established for our private data centers, not for public clouds. So if we had to be compliant with our enterprise needs, we couldn't necessarily use some of the great features that public clouds like Amazon or AWS has, mostly around networking stuff, right? Our stakeholders with their business lines of businesses, we have to make sure that when we modernize our applications, they're using public clouds, they're doing it responsibly. They're doing it the best way possible, using the native tools. Some of our application teams need to level up as they go around. Leveling up means getting used to what working in the cloud, how infrastructure works, how serverless works, how key value stores work versus relational databases. And then, of course, a plan, right? You can't do anything without a plan. So after you work with your stakeholders, you have your leadership support, you kind of set some first milestones, execute a plan. It's always, just like any sort of software development process, accountability, definition of done. Key things. So at Optum, our first milestones, our first plans, no code, organizational changes. The biggest thing that we've struggled with at the beginning were that. What I mean by that is working with your stakeholders, like again, I'll use the security example again because it's something I was personally involved with to a large degree, of talking about how we reframe our intents for what we know to what we need to do in the future. Getting those groups on board and being partners with you on that, right? So that was a lot of work. And then we wanted to set up a foundation for community practice. Since I'll talk about this again in a minute here, we do everything as code. Infrastructure as code, policy as code, documentation, process. that also means a community of practice, because that's a new thing for some folks, and there's guidelines, right? So, and then we want people to contribute. So our first iterations, some learnings here. I think a key decision that we made early on was this everything as code idea again here, right? So what this means is that if you can put stuff into runnable code, like we use Terraform all over the place, great, right? If you can't, like writing a security policy is kind of difficult sometimes for this, write it as close to the metal intent as possible. Like get down to the why, not the how. What's the intent that this need has, a network policy? What are they actually trying to ask you to do here rather than telling you how to do it? If you do it this way, you kind of already have frameworks to fully automate your governance, right? Because that's kind of where we want to be at Optum, UHG, is to all of our major lines of businesses, all the many lines of businesses, they can't be held back by a gatekeeping team to make sure they've done everything correctly. We want to be able to apply our enterprise standards as codified process so they can work as fast as they possibly can across the board. There's no level, it's all as fast as you can go. We want you to do it. Excuse me. However, it's not all roses, right? It's the iteration. So some of our first challenges or first opportunities here came up again in organizational changes. I have an example here, like our internal networks in our data centers, they follow, like most other large enterprises, data centers are, it's a castle moat structure, if you will. It's more sophisticated than that, but give me that one. But we have rules, right? If you have two network segments, they have to be routable. But as soon as they're routable, they have to traverse through data loss prevention, DLP, big giant firewalls, you name it, right? That's the standard. But it doesn't make sense in a public cloud world, especially how we constructed ours, where we follow the many account rule. Every line of business, every application has its own account. It's all by itself, right? So if they have separated their VPCs into subnets, the network security groups or the controls are important, but there's no DLP because it's not mixed data anymore. It's my own data. I'm not losing my data to myself, so I don't need to do that, right? So that's a rewrite on that portion. The bottom two things here are really iterations here. So our DCE, this is our sandbox. DCE is a disposable cloud environment, which I'll cover again here, became a priority because as much as our engineers are high standards, there still needs to be education level set. We need a way for our engineers to be able to learn in a cloud environment in a destructive way without destroying or touching business, right? So that's the sandboxing up. I have more detail about what that is. And of course, Center of Excellence. Keep this thing going, get it up and running, and have that be first principle. So this is a cycle, right? Not necessarily a linear cycle. Each one of these things can spin around themselves over and over again. But as you go, you really are engaging your stakeholders with your plans. If your vision changes or you add to your vision, get your leaders to support you so they know what's happening, set the parameters and expectations. So the second part of our talk is a little more about how we built this framework. There's several categories here. Safe experimentations, DICE, DCE, reasonable patterns. That all comes down to how we build our code, our everything that's code blocks together to produce ways to deploy environments. Security baseline, configuration validation. So like with configuration validation, since we did everything as code, we can do some pre-flight before our Terraform goes out the door, right? So we can even check for violations before things happen. Like I'll pick on Paraz here. If he was using this framework, he could never have set that Redshift to be open, right? You could find it afterwards, but that would have stopped him from doing it. So one accelerator is an intake process. So since we have a really strong way of doing disposable cloud environments. Our accounts are production accounts. That means there's going to be an actual workload there. So there has to be an intake process for our application teams to use. However, we don't want to be gatekeepers too much. Like we don't want to have 6,000 teams asking our intake team, which might be just a few individuals, to help them figure out their stuff. It'll never work. So build an objective workflow with your everything as code, your procedures as code. So everybody that wants an account has a perfect understanding of what's expected of them before they even ask for these accounts. So when that's ready to go, it's almost a non-issue, right? The idea here too is eventually this will be fully automated, or automated as far as we can make it, I guess. DCE here. Now, I have colleagues here at reInvent. They have just finished their talk about this. I highly encourage you to check it out. I'm very, very proud of the work they have done on this one here. What DICE is a way for us to have transient cloud accounts. So it's a little more in the sandbox. It could be things for destructive learning. These can be things where you can put workloads, experimental workloads. Let's say you're a data scientist and you just want to run a data science VM with some data. And let's say you forget about it, right? Well, this gets blown up anyways, it's destroyed. It's totally nuked. You can do it all over again. Instant access, totally self-service. You can provision accounts all day long. We can do this forever and ever and ever. We have thousands of developers working on this at once if they want to. So this is our primary way of doing everyday work on Optum for a cloud team. This has just been open sourced, like literally just now. That's why it's not in this slide, but it's at github.com/optum/DCE. Please check it out. It's really powerful stuff, and they did some great work there. And then one last accelerator, or not one last, but one other accelerator here is our idea of a Launchpad. Not quite a landing zone. This actually predates landing zones as far as we knew about them. And this one has more, it does things beyond what landing zone can do for you. Our application team's focusing on delivering applications, services, data, you name it. Our cloud teams will deliver the infrastructure per account, or there can be a little blur line in between. You know, there is a line there just for illustration purposes, but if an app team wants to control some infrastructure, go right ahead. But they really can't touch the green stuff. That's where we keep our protections on our accounts. So, like the OU policies for Amazon organizations, which we do use for this instance here. You can't turn off CloudWatch, you can't turn off other things, but then also we enforce configuration validations, drift detection, network baselining, and other controls. And then our central logging, which works across all of our accounts, works across all of our compute environments, private cloud, and others. And then we get a holistic view of what all our accounts are doing, all of our accounts are doing, in the sense we have thousands. One last accelerator, again, not last, sorry. Another one here is our inner source model. It's open source, but we're a giant company. We can do our own stuff internally and make it feel like it's an open source thing. So since we are fully infrastructure as code with everything we're talking about here, we build these Terraform modules. And since we have our security policies written in a way that can be applied as code, we can endorse our modules, our Terraform modules, ahead of time. So if I'm building a new environment and I'm pulling together ECS and the egress proxy and S3 and RDS, I can pull those modules together and skip any sort of security review with those things as long as I'm using the correct tagged ones, the most current ones, et cetera, and I haven't modified them. So what this graph here shows is a little bit of fuzzy graph. It shows the individual effort to build, any more contributions, and then the amount of reuse, right? So some of these things are reused constantly and saves a ton of time, major reuse. Another thing we have done here is, since the cloud team has made a lot of these, if there's a new service, like some of the new services that were launched this week, we haven't got around to making those modules yet. There are tight guidelines for you to build your own, and they contribute back to the core. So then somebody else can use them again, and so on and so forth, right? This has been an incredibly successful initiative inside of Optum. finally, a last accelerator, is this is kind of our version of like a migration factory. We expect most of our application teams to do their own migrations for the applications, but however, they might need any one of these 6 categories or all of them, right? They might need some education, some training, staff augmentation. If they're using vendors in their products, can we have our vendors meet with our AWS professionals to help figure what this is out? So the idea is we do have a team that can help our application teams work together and then either move away or continue on. So I'll wrap up with some of the results here. So since we have so much stuff that's done as code, we can automate a lot, pretty much everything that we put our minds to. So 70% of effort of time is pipelining everything. We made 3 million automated configuration changes in 2019. And of course, our operation and maintenance labor has gone way, way down because we don't have to stop the world, have midnight deploy sessions. It just goes, right? And I'll skip to the modernization one. Since we kind of insist that our first movers modernize at the same time, they can take advantage, just like Paraz's Fender example, cost savings. Moving off of monolithic application containers down to serverless, or using better utilizing databases. And of course, the classic cost savings argument applies very greatly. We just don't have overused capacity or unused capacity in a cloud model because it's all elastic. Like at private data assurance, we forecast and we buy, we may or may not use it. So that's kind of our story. I know it's not maybe as deeply technical, but any one of those things we talked about, I could have spent an hour or 2 talking about. There's some really cool stuff there. Please check out DCE. I'm really, again, proud of that work. And I'll get Praz back up on stage.
All right. Thank you, Rajiv. It's always the best case, right? When you can hear from peers, and if you can learn something from a company of United Health Group size, which is by far the world's largest healthcare company, right? It's incredible work that you guys have done. Thank you for sharing the story. Now, before I wrap up, I have a short summary of what I'd like you to take to your office, right? We can't keep it all in, right? Especially given the amount of content that you guys have been exposed to over the week. If there are 3 things that I want you to take away from this talk, right? These are those, right? These are those 3 things. First, right? Rajiv talked about the challenges that they went through at UHG, and we've seen this across customers, right? First thing, make sure that you have absolute buy-in from your executives, right, in your company. Having leadership support makes it so much easier to embark on such a large journey, right? Second, making sure that your landing zone is built in a way where you really are allowing your teams to innovate and scale, experiment, fail fast, and hopefully succeed along the way on multiple of these experiments, right? Making sure that is set up correctly is very important. So I would encourage you to spend time learning about the landing zone. We've got Control Tower, which will make it really easy for you. It even has a nice UI where it'll show you all the OUs that you've got, all the accounts, and all the detective and preventive guardrails, and if there are any findings and things like that, right? So if you want to learn more about Control Tower, just look it up in the app. I'm sure there are more sessions today and tomorrow, right? The last one is building that migration factory, right? Getting that piece correct with all the tools, the processes is extremely important, right? And Rajiv talked about how United Health Group was able to drive a lot of efficiencies by having repeatable content, right? So all the policies that these guys have built in Terraform are used so many times. It's an initial investments that your teams made, but over time it was significantly useful for a lot of their teams so that they could basically use what they already have and accelerate that journey, right? So very important there. Automation, automate, super important. Find every opportunity that you can find and spend the time automating it so that you will save significant amount of time later, right? Obviously, optimization is another one, right? Move to serverless. If you can move to models where you can get away from the undifferentiated heavy lifting, it makes life easier for everybody, and everybody sleeps well as well. With that, I want to thank you for coming. Enjoy the rest of re:Invent, and please complete the survey when you find time. Take care.